When harm happens in a school, people have to figure it out. And there can be retributive means. For instance, a person can be suspended for a day or two, or maybe they can involve some restitution by their family to another student or whatever. But generally, the amazing thing about schools is they are set up very well for restorative justice, and particularly for Indigenous forms of restorative justice. And a basic formula for Indigenous justice is this: we've got the harmer and the harmed, but it's never one person for each, ever. If a person harms someone, it's because most often they have been harmed, or they have experienced and witnessed harm, which is another form of harm. And so what that means is that it's not about the person who harmed, it's about understanding the context in which they've come from and knowing that they will continue to perform harm if they continue to witness harm or are harmed.
Suspensions, expulsions, and punitive measures disproportionately affect Indigenous and Black students. My name is Stan Baker, one of the co-hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. Our guest this episode is Niigaan Sinclair. He's an Anishinaabe writer, editor, activist, and head of the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Niigaan Sinclair leads the conversation on how principals can break the cycle of harm and build a school culture rooted in Indigenous principles of justice and community.
Today's podcast is brought to you by the word privilege, which comes from the Latin combination meaning private or individual, and law. Initially, it meant a special law or legal advantage granted to an individual or specific group. Today, it is often used in discussions of social justice to highlight unearned advantages or systemic benefits granted to certain groups based on race, gender, class, or other characteristics, often without their direct awareness.
Check out our website, www.restorative.ca, for circle suggestions that address privilege and can reduce suspensions and expulsions at your school. Now let's join Niigaan Sinclair with your host, Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan.
I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the state of justice within the Indigenous community.
People have been struggling to try to get Indigenous forms of justice into the justice system and society at large for a very long period of time. And going back to my first experience with was it with in ceremony, but then the larger Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba from 88 through 90. My father was head of that, co-commissioner for that inquiry. And one of the things that they said was that we have to look at the ways in which Indigenous peoples perform justice not as a noun, but as a verb. As justice isn't something that we aspire to, it's something that we work to create. And meaning that there isn't a formula for you do this crime, this is your punishment. And there's only two punishments. In the Canadian justice system, the only language of punishment is one of two things: money or jail. So that's it. There's no kindness, there's like this ornamental apology or statement of victims or this, like none of that stuff really matters. It's all at the option. I was just witnessing the statements of harm that were made at a horrible trial of the serial killer of Indigenous women here in Manitoba. That was the option of the judge. Like the judge was the one who decided that. What that means is there's no formula and there's no inclusion of anything restorative in any element of the justice system. The whole point of the justice system is to separate people, is to bring harm to a harmful situation. I would speak for everybody when I would say that the solution to harm is not more harm. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's recidivism and people continue to perform crime or feel unsafe, or there's this massive problem with policing, because the solution to policing is never more police. Anyways, we have to be creative and we have to be innovative. I can tell you the most critical in ways that justice has moved in Winnipeg is because citizens have rejected the justice system. And they've said, this is not the formula for success. What they've done is they've created community patrols They've refused to call police and deal with things in other means, and especially in communities. And I would say that generally people, while having been working with the justice system and helping them, and is I've seen the most inroads when people just openly flout the law. They just reject it. And one of the options that the judges have now, and they don't know this because the government passed this and basically dumped this on the plates of judges and the justice system, is that now that we have Bill C-15, which is the implementation of Indigenous rights, and Canadian law is supposed to come in harmony with Indigenous rights, that is the out for judges to, for the first time in history, see another legal system other than the British common law system, or the system that Canada purports to create justice out of, which never creates justice. Like almost never justice is created other than people are thrown away in the slammer for the rest of their lives, and somehow that fixes a situation, which never does. Mental health fixes a situation. Kindness and generosity and restitution fits. So that's what fixes situations. And then most of all, the simple principle that we're all in this together. And Indigenous peoples absolutely understand this. And this is where I'm going to bridge back to schools for a second, because I think that's what this podcast is about.
Yep.
So one of the amazing things about schools that is that without considering the most egregious of harms, like for example, performing really brutal violent act on someone, or doing something in a repeated manner in which that created a great scale of harm, or the other kind of things that are very egregious, like assault or abuse or those kinds of things. With the exception of those, generally, when harm happens in a school, people have to figure it out. And there can be retributive means. For instance, a person can be suspended for a day or two, or maybe they can involve some restitution by their family to another student or whatever. But generally, the amazing thing about schools is they are set up very well for restorative justice, and particularly for Indigenous forms of restorative justice. And a basic formula for Indigenous justice is this: we've got the harmer and the harmed, but it's never one person for each, ever. If a person harms someone, it's because most often they have been harmed, or they have experienced and witnessed harm, which is another form of harm. And so what that means is that it's not about the person who harmed, it's about understanding the context in which they've come from and knowing that they will continue to perform harm if they continue to witness harm or are harmed. So that means we have to deal with all the challenges that they are dealing with as a result of being harmed. And then secondly, the person who was harmed oftentimes goes and harms somebody else, or again, the system and the cycles continue, or they have, in the process of dealing with their harm, have brought other people into that scenario. They've either witnessed the harm, or they need now, they give up their work and someone else has to do their work for them, or they, for one reason or another, can't fulfill a duty that then someone is then harmed as a result. That means that it's not really about an individual. Justice will never be about an individual, this person versus this person situation. And our job is to punish this person, harmer, without forgetting the harmed, or the fact that there was people who harmed both of them or are now being harmed as a result. It's a realization that harm is something collective always. That's the baseline of Indigenous justice, which is that harm is always collective. And that means that as much as the community experiences a harm, the community will also come up with the solution for the harm. And that will never be in a pie chart or a formula chart, like this crime equals 12 years. It will never be that. It will always be that the community determines good, bad, great, ugly. And I'm not telling you communities get it right all the time. I'm just telling you that communities have the ability and the power to be able to make decisions, but everyone's got to be a part of the system. It doesn't happen overnight, especially after having been undermined for 150 years of Indigenous justice systems. So it's got to be rebuilt slowly. And it's also got to be given in recognition that Indigenous peoples can help lead and probably are the best people to lead. And there's about 100 examples I have of that.
That really resonates with me. I think it does with Steve and Shelley too, but I wouldn't speak for them. One of the things that, and that's part of the work that we did in the school boards that we were part of, was how to address that harm that happens not only to individuals, but to the community. What we've also experienced is that certainly with suspensions and expulsions, those are things that isolate and alienate individuals from community, and Indigenous and Black kids are overrepresented in the numbers of kids that are suspended or expelled. What kinds of things can you suggest to principals in order to be able to address those situations with suspensions and expulsions?
Here's the biggest lesson that I can tell you, and I'll use the example of a police officer, all right? Because I think that's generally how every principal is viewed by some kind of person of peace, but most markedly of retribution, or a person who's holding the law at the center. When a police officer shows up in an Indigenous community, nobody thinks you're there to help.
Right.
Everybody thinks, oh, what do I got to do to protect myself and protect my family and protect my possessions? What did I do wrong? That's actually usually the first. And this doesn't really matter who you are. Like, it doesn't, like when I had long hair, and I used to have long hair to my waist until about a year ago. And every time I got pulled over, I was told that I resembled a suspect every time. Even when I was driving in the most wealthiest area of Winnipeg or the poorest area, I always resembled a suspect. And so that's why I was pulled over, unless I rolled through a stop sign or something. But so my very first thought, my historically constructed thought, which is every single time I see a police officer, they immediately are a danger to me. And I don't care if you're a person who grew up on a reserve, rural, poor, or if you're an urban, fairly well-known public figure professor. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And the fact is that as soon as people see my name and they go, "Oh, Niigaan Sinclair," immediately they're treat me different, like immediately. And here's my point: is that for principals, they oftentimes, before they enter the room, are the impetus for the acting out or the challenge or the situation that will be then created as a result of entering the room. That's not your fault, but it is your inheritance. And that means that a principal has to work very hard for years, and this comes from time, commitment, ethics, patience, all the things necessary to build healthy relationships. That a principal will need to work on that for 5 to 10 months before they even talk to a kid about retribution and punishment. In the first 5 to 10 months, I guarantee that kid's going to be probably acting out the second they see you. They don't trust you. Why would they trust you? Because it's not really about you. It's about all the principles before you, but it's also about the fact that the system is just built to hate Indigenous peoples. Sometimes people get uncomfortable when I say that, but show me how the system loves Indigenous peoples. Show me that. And so then what am I left with? I'm talking about textbooks. I'm talking about posters on the wall. I'm talking about who go to any organization like the government of Canada. We'll use that as an example, as the model, but if that was represent Canadians, and give me a picture of cabinet or a picture of the leadership within parties or a picture of the people who voted for them, and they're almost always white and male, almost always. That's not a fluke. That's not some earned position. If it is, then I guess we're all just ready to accept that white men are the only people who matter. And I don't believe that for a second, because I know a couple of them. And my point is, they are not the best people to run things. They are not always the number one brilliant minds of our generation. There's also women. There's also Indigenous peoples and Black women, Black Indigenous peoples. there's lots of people who are brilliant and there's lots of people who achieve. So then what we're left with is we're left with the fact that there are systems at play that will always make sure that Indigenous peoples end up in suspensions, punishments, jails, child welfare system, diabetes, lower lifespans. There are systems that ensure that. And principals have to know, they have to understand those systems. Those take years to understand, especially if you're not most directly impacted. And anyone who thinks that we all start at the same starting line just simply doesn't understand the system. It just simply doesn't understand. In fact, if I ever hear anybody, I don't see race, or I don't see why we can't all just work hard and all get to the same place. That person should never be a principal, because they are influencing lives and clearly have not done their own work to analyze how they got to be where they are, which is due to their race and gender, due to their privilege. And that doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means that they inherited a whole bunch of things. Just like I also inherited privilege too. So my father is who he is. I grew up fairly okay. I certainly didn't experience sexual abuse, which is already different than a lot of my relatives. And I grew up in an environment where my father demanded me to go to school and said, despite the racism and the fact that you were going to be experiencing trauma in school, your still job was to keep going. And so thank God for hockey, because I never would have cared about school. I would have had no outlet for my trauma. And so there we go. Like, I have privilege too. But my job is to understand my life so that I can help others. That's why I think oftentimes I can do this work and I do public work. And it's because I've spent a whole lifetime understanding privilege, entitlement, some of it my own, but also most markedly the people who I played hockey with, who I went to school with, people who would oftentimes stand in the way of my father. I can remember my dad was appointed the first judge of Manitoba history. And the first week he's on the job, all the judges had a lunch together. And he's the only Indigenous face in that room. And this one guy says to him, he goes, Murray, you're only here because you're Indigenous and we feel bad. And he said, you're only here because you're a white guy. So I think we're all here because of reasons.
Love it. Love it. So understanding the system you're in and your privilege, I think, is great advice for principals. What does it take for a principal to truly understand the inequities facing their students? Well, it starts with understanding their own privilege. School leaders can be agents of real change by embracing restorative practices where it intersects with Indigenous justice. Find out more about our work with circles that support Indigenous education and restorative practices at www.restorative.ca. This is part 3 of 4, and our next episode talks about how important it is for principals to become a good friend or relative with Indigenous communities.